What's up, guys? I'm Chris Spags here, back to another Four Corners video breaking down tonight's NBA slate. Our first after the All-Star break is coming to you courtesy of Osmo.com. Now, we've had a week off, but let's keep the energy up and make sure to like this video right now and leave a comment down below telling me which player on the slate you're finding the hardest to avoid. Pretty sure there's going to be a couple guys that we're going to talk about fit that criteria. But make sure to just like the video right now and leave a comment or a question. I'll pop in later, talk with you guys. So make sure to do that right now. Like the video, leave a comment down below. The first corner I want to hit on is a game with the Kings visiting the Warriors. This one comes with the slate high 239 point total, but it's one that favors the Warriors by 11 points at home. The Kings have actually done a pretty good job staying close in games with the Warriors this year. Each of their 3 games so far has been decided by 5 points or less, but it is a bit of a risk here. Again, the Warriors favored by 11, not where you want to be, especially when they're at home and a spot where they've been known to put teams away. DeMarcus Cousins is the first guy you're going to want to look at based on the fact he's going to be the highest owned guy in the slate at 61% projected ownership right now by us at Osmo.com. That number does check out, though. He shot up 17 shots versus Utah in his last game before the break. It's the most he's put up as a Warrior so far. And then he got a rest game. So we're seeing a well-rested DeMarcus Cousins going in a spot where he's also against the former team who he really doesn't seem to like much. He's pushed his usage pretty high in games versus Sacramento since leaving them so far. In games versus Sacramento over the last couple seasons, he's had fantasy point days of 70.75 fantasy points, 83.75 fantasy points, and 63.25 fantasy points. I don't know that you're going to see those heights, given that, again, it's a different team. The Warriors are going to take a little more shots than his other previous efforts did on the Pelicans. But overall, Cousins looks like a great play and a guy who's worth matching the field on, especially now that we know his minutes cap has been lifted. It's unclear if he's going to see a ton more minutes, but at least he can if the opportunity presents itself. Draymond Green and Klay Thompson look like the better plays on the side for the Warriors alongside Cousins. Again, similarly priced guys. You know, they still have a little bit of upside at that price. Draymond Green hasn't shown a crazy high ceiling since Cousins has come on board. But overall, his role is secure. He's not going to have as much playmaking time, not as much rebounding with Cousins there, but he gets enough to be useful, so I think he's fine. And I feel more comfortable with those guys than I do, say, Steph Curry and Kevin Durant. Steph Curry and Kevin Durant, I'm not sure you can trust the usage quite as much, especially with Cousins' usage on the rise. And again, another spot where he's going to probably shoot the ball a little more, force the action because he doesn't like the Kings and the way they handled him leaving town. So I think I worry a little bit more about those guys, and I'm okay going to Green and Thompson just because they're reasonably priced. Harrison Barnes is going to be another of the highest owned players on the slate tonight, though not quite to the same degree as DeMarcus Cousins is. But I don't know that it makes a ton of sense. I like Barnes. I think his price is very reasonable on DraftKings at $4,700, but he did put up 11 rebounds in that last game where he really exceeded value for the Kings. He also shot it a bunch more, but the rebounds are what worries me the most because I find that to be the least repeatable for him. He's only put up double-digit rebounds twice this year, so I think you're pretty unlikely to see that happen again today. Could happen. I mean, it could be a function of his role and where he's playing with the Kings and this positioning and all that. But overall, I worry a little bit about Barnes. I think he's a fine play for the price, but as one of the higher owned guys on the slate, I think I would just match the field on him and not go too crazy. Buddy Hield's the other King I would look at first. He's put up 21 shots in each of the 3 games versus the Warriors so far this year, and those results have been solid for him. He's put up 48.25, 37.5, and 44.25 fantasy points in those matchups, so he is using those shots pretty well, hitting value. Can always go south, obviously, as a points-dependent scorer like Buddy Hield mostly is. Things can break in a variety of ways, but I think he looks good here, and you know that they're going to at least dedicate some time to him getting the ball because that's what they've done over and over again so far this year. Willie Cauley-Stein has also looked good in his last 2 games versus the Warriors, and he's gotten over 30 minutes in them, which might be the more important part. In those 2 games, he's put up fantasy point outputs of 43.75 and 44.25. The minutes have been there versus the Warriors. I think it could change a little bit now that they have Cousins on the other side, though it doesn't seem like it's a risk for Cauley-Stein to see less minutes, just a risk for him to maybe not be as effective in them. I have less interest in the rest of the Kings. I think Bogdan Bogdanovic could get going off the bench, especially if that first unit falters, so he's a little bit of an interesting play. But De'Aaron Fox and Marvin Bagley, I worry about the minutes for Bagley. Fox, the usage hasn't really been there, and he hasn't had any big outlier days, and I don't know that I see this matchup being the one where he suddenly breaks out again after kind of leveling out to a decent spot, but where his price is probably not worth it for the ceiling that he's shown. The next corner I want to hit on is a game with the Suns visiting the Cavs. This one is a 220.5 point total, which is not one of the higher ones on the slate, but it does represent a 4.8 point boost for Phoenix and a 6.8 point boost for Cleveland. Devin Booker's $7,700 price on DraftKings makes him pretty appealing. He's going to be a higher usage play here, and he's actually faltered a little bit recently, but those have been in games where the defense has been solid. And the case with the Cavs, as we know, is not going to be one where the defense is solid. They've allowed 49.1% shooting from the floor this year, as well as 37.1% from deep. These things should benefit Devin Booker quite a bit. bit, and I think you'll see his usage push higher as he recognizes there won't be anybody who's going to defend him well. So I like Booker quite a bit here. I think he's a really solid play and one that's worth the field's ownership on him. Tyler Johnson hasn't played well for Phoenix so far, averaging just 0.59 fantasy points per minute, but he has been seeing about 30 minutes a game, and even though the return of D'Anthony Melton could cut into that ever so slightly, I do think Tyler Johnson's going to get a good shot to get going here. I like him a bit in the matchup. I think it makes sense for him. I think, again, the defensive reasons we just mentioned for Devin Booker should benefit Tyler Johnson as well. His usage won't be that high, but he can do a little more with assisting, a little more from rebounding. So I think Tyler Johnson's a fine play and one probably worth having some decent exposure to. DeAndre Ayton looks pretty good here, though the Cavs interior is pretty underrated overall. They've been good with Tristan Thompson. A lot of people have been good with Tristan Thompson, the buzz on the street is, but they've also been pretty good without him, mostly limiting guys on the boards, limiting offensive rebound attempts in particular. So I think Ayton's a fine play, but not one I'm dying to have because I think the Cavs do a decent job inside. For whatever reason, whatever they're doing with their game plan, I think it works for them. The wings on Phoenix are also another place to look. Kelly Oubre, Mikal Bridges, and Josh Jackson have also been pretty good recently. I think Josh Jackson looks like the steadiest play. Kelly Oubre probably has the most upside. And Mikal Bridges, not a ton of upside, but he's a pretty decent cash game type play. I think overall these guys look okay. A mix of them makes sense to me. They're not as high priority to me as Booker or even Ayton. Definitely not as high priority as Tyler Johnson. But I think overall some exposure to these guys makes sense because, again, this is going to be a game with some scoring and one where the Cavs are not going to defend very well. Jordan Clarkson had a monster day versus Brooklyn in his last game before the All-Star break, hitting 64.5 fantasy points. That won't happen again. That one was due to a triple overtime. But it does seem like he's in a pretty good spot with his usage. He's been over 16 shots in 6 out of his last 7 games. Ever since the roles changed for both him and Colin Sexton as a result of Alec Burks getting shipped out of town. I think it looks good for Clarkson again here. No problem with him, and I think he's worth having a pretty decent exposure to. Colin Sexton has had less peripheral value than Jordan Clarkson, and he hasn't shown the ceiling, obviously, that Clarkson has, but he's also been putting up 17 shots in 6 out of his last 7 games, so the usage is there. The opportunity is there for him, and his price is pretty reasonable. A little bit harder to trust because, again, he's a scoring-dependent guy, but Colin Sexton looks fine to me. Both he and Clarkson should have to score quite a bit here if Phoenix also gets rolling on the other side. Kevin Love's minutes should be up again, probably in the low 20s, one would expect here after where his minutes were before the All-Star break. He looks pretty good, but not good enough, I think, worth where his price is. I think what you're more likely to see is him cutting into the upside of Larry Nance and Marquise Chris especially. But I think Nance is still playable. Love, probably not playable. And Chris, I think, is an interesting revenge play if things break his way and he does see enough minutes, but not worth a ton of exposure. Nance would be a little bit more interesting, though, if he does pick up a start, so that's something to keep an eye on in the lineups. In fact, I would only pay for Nance if he were picking up the start because his price is just a little bit too high. His minutes should be steady regardless, but I think there's enough risk there if he's coming off the bench where he's just not going to see enough opportunity to get where he needs to get. The third corner to hit on today is a game with the Rockets visiting the Lakers. This one has a 233-point combined total. One that represents a 4.9-point boost for Houston and a 2.8-point boost for the Lakers. LeBron James has claimed that his intensity mode has been activated as a result of him needing to do more to get the Lakers into the playoffs. And honestly, while that all sounds like corny LeBron speak, it does bear out so far. In his last 3 games, he's had 2 of them over 70 fantasy points before the All-Star break. And there is a big difference between a disengaged LeBron and a LeBron that forces action. I think LeBron is going to force the action again tonight. I think it's a tough matchup versus the Rockets, given that their pace is going to be down quite a bit. And defensively, the Rockets have looked a little bit better. Still not great, but they are doing a good job throwing wings at people. But I think LeBron is an interesting pivot, especially because we're considering Giannis Antetokounmpo to be one of the highest owned guys on the slate. And LeBron has very comparable upside, but is going to be much less owned. So I think LeBron is a decent play and one to have if you're going to run it back with some Rockets on the other side. Kyle Kuzma and Brandon Ingram look pretty close to me in terms of the value that they're presenting. Kuzma's a little higher priced on DraftKings, but I think that's fine. I'd rather pay for him anyway. He's just going to shoot the ball more, whereas Brandon Ingram is a little better with the ball in his hands, and he's forced the action a little bit more, but overall, he's not where Kuzma is in terms of putting up 20 shots plus a game. I think Kuzma's a better play. Ingram's also fine because the price is close enough, but honestly, both these guys could have a decent enough day. I would just have more Kuzma than Ingram if it were my choice. JaVale McGee's run went down quite a bit last game versus Atlanta, in part because the bigs just kept getting into a ton of foul trouble on the other side. So the Hawks went smaller, and McGee just didn't see the floor as a result. But in this game, with Clint Capella expected back in the lineup for the Rockets, you would think that JaVale McGee should see his full run of minutes here. His price is up, which isn't great, but McGee looks like a pretty strong play here. And again, he's going to have to counter Capella, and that's going to give him a nice run of opportunity here. As I just mentioned, Clint Capella is going to be back in the lineup for the Rockets, and with his price down because of his time spent on the sidelines with the injury, think he's an interesting play here. Not one that I would necessarily want a ton of, but I think at his price, it makes some sense to have some exposure to him. It was a thumb/hand injury that kept Clint Capella sidelined, so you shouldn't see a very harsh minutes cap for him because it's not an injury that would result in him needing less minutes on the floor. He's fine. It looks like he's been fine in practice, so I think he's a pretty safe play today. James Harden is likely to see a little bit less usage and less rebounding upside with Clint Capella back in the fold, but the upside that Capella's pick and roll game with Harden presents should give him some more assist upside and probably some more open shots for Harden, which I think is a benefit given the fact that he's really shown that he cares a lot about this 30-point streak. Harden's going to be one of the highest owned guys on the slate, so from that perspective, there may be some logic in going elsewhere, but overall, Harden's price is pretty reasonable for what he's done recently. I don't mind going to him tonight, and I think matching the field probably makes sense if he's going to be owned by about a quarter of the folks out there playing tonight's slate. And Chris Paul's also not a bad pivot at just 10% ownership. It's much less ownership than what Harden's projected for, so I don't mind Paul here, but obviously Harden, is going to be putting up a ton of shots because he cares a lot about that scoring record and the numbers he's put up so far. And I'm just going to mention Eric Gordon and PJ Tucker because both guys project pretty well for me. I think the pace up spot is going to benefit them pretty well. Not guys you want a ton of, but I think if you're having some exposure to this game, putting in a little bit of Eric Gordon and PJ Tucker in some of your lineups probably does make sense if you're entering multiple lineups tonight. And the last corner I want to hit on is a game with a 230-point combined total between the Blazers and the Nets. And this one represents a 2.7-point boost for Portland and a 1.7-point boost for Brooklyn. The first Blazer who jumps out to me is Yusuf Nurkic. His minutes haven't been the steadiest in the world, but at just 10% projected ownership tonight, I think he looks like a fine play. Jarrett Allen, a tough defender, but he doesn't have the size really to keep up with Nurkic in a meaningful way. And Nurkic can shoot quite a bit here, so I think that Nurkic is in a fine spot, and he's probably my favorite Blazer, even though he's one of the less secure Blazers, I would say. Certainly not a Damian Lillard in terms of the safety you feel by having him in your lineup. So that's why I'm okay with Damian Lillard at 17% ownership. His ankle injuries aren't the best thing in the world, but I think this matchup is perfectly fine for him. Overall, I think Lillard looks like an okay play. And again, a guy who seems like he's got a more secure floor while still having a pretty decent ceiling. And I don't think you can say that about the other guys on the Blazers side. Speaking of guys with a bit less secure role, CJ McCollum fits that criteria. He's been pretty cold in his last 3 games, but he had a hot run of 5 games before that. In the last 3 games, McCollum has shot 5 for 20, 6 for 17, and 5 for 13 in that blowout win versus Golden State. So McCollum really just needs his shot to fall, and I think you'll see that usage trickle up. If his shot falls today, you could see him get more run here. And if CJ falters, I think you'll see more scoring opportunity for Jake Layman and Al-Farouq Aminu, both guys who pick up the slack with the scoring, as we saw last game versus Golden State. D'Angelo Russell has had 60.25 and 55.75 fantasy points in his last 2 games. The latter was boosted quite a bit by the triple overtime game versus Cleveland, just seeing that extra run of minutes and opportunity. But overall, Russell's usage rate has been above 30% more often than it's not. He hasn't been meaningfully affected by Karis LeVert's return to the lineup, and he doesn't have Shabazz Napier and Spencer Dinwiddie breathing down his neck quite as much anymore. Dinwiddie obviously out of the lineup. Napier not seizing as many minutes recently. So I like Russell here. I think he's in a perfectly good spot. Karis LeVert got up to 30 minutes last game, and that looks good for him because that seems like that's about where his minutes cap should be expected to be moving forward because he didn't play towards the tail end of that first overtime, and he didn't play at all in the second and third overtime. So I think Karis LeVert's going to have a pretty good run here. He's at a reasonable price still. I like where he is. I like where his usage has been, and I think he still has some upside. So I like Karis LeVert quite a bit as well. Jarrett Allen needs to see a little bit more minutes to be useful, but I think he's in a pretty decent spot here. He can always lose some minutes to former Blazer Ed Davis, but Allen, if he's getting the minutes, I think is a decent play. Rebound rate not crazy high, certainly not getting enough shots, so I think there's some risk whenever you play him, but he looks pretty good overall in this matchup. I would have some of him, and I'll also have some Ed Davis just in case things break his way and Jarrett Allen gets in foul trouble versus a Yusuf Nurkic, who does get to the line at a pretty decent rate. Joe Harris has actually been priced down after the All-Star break, despite hitting over 5.6x value in 6 out of his last 7 games, and that was at a higher price threshold. So I like Joe Harris quite a bit. Obviously, the 3-point shootout thing should carry some momentum for him. It was a pretty big showing for him on a national stage, but even if he didn't have that, I think he's looked really good recently. They're really dedicated to getting him shots out at 3. I think overall, Joe Harris looks like a fine play, and his $4,300 price on DraftKings is really hard to avoid on tonight's slate. And if a guy like Joe Harris were to falter, I think you could see some slack picked up by Allen Crabbe and Shabazz Napier. Both guys are in revenge spots versus their former team in Portland. I don't know that I would want to roster a ton of those guys, but Joe Harris looks so good to me that I might have a little bit of exposure just in case he fails, and that usage goes somewhere else to a guy like Crabbe, who's also been pretty good recently as well. So there we go. Those are my thoughts on this first NBA slate after the All-Star break. Make sure to like the video and leave a comment down below. Tell me which player you simply can't quit thus far in your lineups tonight. Also, any questions or whatever, I'll pop in later to give my advice if you guys want any of that. But of course, just like the video and leave a comment. Your participation means a lot, helps us with the video and all that as well. So like the video, leave a comment. And of course, if you want half off your first month at Awesemo.com, use the promo code SWITCH and HEDGE that I'm dropping in right here. That'll give you 50% off of the first month of any package, and you'll get all of Awesemo's ownership projections and rankings right at your fingertips, as well as projections from Josh Engelman. You can just plug right into Fantasy Cruncher. It's a lot of value. The deep dive column every day does a great job for our premium folks as well, and the premium Slack in which we're participating and answering questions, as well as a lot of people just cross-chatting and suggesting some great ideas for every slate on there as well. So use the promo code SWITCH and HEDGE. Get half off your first month at Awesemo.com. So there we go. Just make sure to like the video right now and leave a comment. And I'll be back again soon breaking down another NBA slate in this Four Corners video of ours. So good luck, folks.